Right, exactly.
So let's talk right about it. Let's jump in there.
Okay, so the four different subtypes are dominant, creative, normalizing, and harmonizing. And for those of you who are into type, you're a type geek. Basically, the difference is your first two cognitive functions. In this case, for an ISTJ, it'd be introverted sensing, what we call memory, and extroverted thinking, or what we've nicknamed effectiveness. Whether or not these functions prefer a more assertive position, like they are more what Dario calls analytic. So they are more focused, they're more single-minded, they're more driven, and they have an energy that sort of goes out, right? It's not extroversion so much as it is more just a certainty, like a sense of taking what's inside and pushing out to the world, right? It's a more driven position.
And just to make sure you're understanding as we go through this, just in case you're new, we're not talking about the person being assertive. We're talking about the part of their cognition that's more focused.
Right. Although that oftentimes shows up as more assertiveness in the individual as well.
Certainly.
And the other way that these functions can show up is what Dario calls holistic, which is a more receptive position. It's not as focused, it's not as targeted, but it's more open. And so instead of focusing on a single point, it more takes in peripheral information, and it tends to have higher degrees of openness, but less focus, less direction. And depending upon the combination of each of these functions, preference for a more analytic, focused, or holistic peripheral experience, then that alters how the type shows up. So the first subtype we'll talk about is the dominant subtype. And the dominant subtype is a more confident and driven version of an ISTJ. It tends to be attracted to managerial and leadership positions, and it's a moving the self and others toward goals, large and small. And so a big part of how an ISTJ with dominant subtype preferences shows up is they're using a bit of charisma, but a lot of managerial capacity to move people towards goals, both large and small. So there's an in-charge style that they take in Linda Barron's interactive style vernacular. So there's a lot of focusing in on listening and speaking, a lot of language-based reasoning. There's a high degree of impulse control that these ISTJs possess. They're adept at mental planning, logic. They are good at conceptual thinking, and they have a strong managerial style, right? Or at least they have natural talent towards managing. They weigh their values and what they know as hard lines against the demands of what is happening here and now. And that is how they problem solve. They go, okay, well, how should it be set up? But what is actually happening? And how do I meet those two things? And they have a tendency to use a little bit of emotional inspiration. They pepper in some emotional inspiration to get the job done. So this is a more just generally assertive ISTJ. And I think sometimes ISTJs mistype themselves as ESTJs if they have a dominant flavoring. Because it appears to be so assertive. It appears to be so managerial. And so a lot of ISTJs with this style or this flavor mistake themselves for extroverts because they have that sense of wanting to move others along.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is both of the cognitive functions are analytic and focused for this particular subtype, just in case you're following along, type geek following along right now.
Right, exactly. So both the introverted sensing or memory and the extroverted thinking or effectiveness have an analytic flavoring to it. It prefers to have that assertive energy. So what kind of careers are suited for the style of ISTJ? Well, there was a couple things that were mentioned on your list, actually, quite a few managerial positions. They gravitate towards business and technical activities. And they usually rise, right? They are very good at rising in the ranks to administrative, managerial, or even political roles. Yeah. And so that's very common. But they might also dip their toe in other things. They might end up becoming coaches. They are not bad at counseling. Like oftentimes they find themselves in counseling positions. Instructional design, nursing, public speaking, teaching, tech support, writing. These are all places that dominant ISTJs can be found. And there is a sense of certainty that they bring to all of these positions. And so the flavoring that they end up in makes it so that it's very easy for other people to rest into their sense of certainty because they have such a driven place that they're coming from.
Yeah. I would say these ISTJs are probably the most comfortable with hierarchy and, playing in a hierarchical system, and certainly driven toward being at the top. If you're assertive and you have more of a dominant style like this, you're going to be okay with being the boss or the manager that's in charge. The other thing too is I think these are probably the most goal-oriented of all the ISTJs. They set a goal, an intention with focus moving toward that goal or that intention. I think this is going to be that style of ISTJ.
Right, exactly.